Why are Democrats worried about Kenosha?
I think that your numbers illustrate why they're worried about Kenosha, and that is because Biden's lead in Wisconsin has shrunk over the last 2 months. At the same time, the protests have become less popular, and at the same time, Black Lives Matter have become less popular. And the other thing I'll note, right, is if you're ahead, you want the least amount of variables involved that could potentially slim your lead, while if you're Donald Trump, you want the most amount of chaos potentially out there so that you can shrink your deficit. So the numbers right now still indicate that Joe Biden is ahead, but obviously the events over the last 2 months have not exactly been helpful to the former vice president's campaign.
Harry, I don't want to paint with too broad of a brush. There are electoral differences between Minnesota and Wisconsin. Will you speak to some of the differences that you think are significant?
Yeah, I mean, first off, as you noted, obviously Hillary Clinton won in Minnesota 4 years ago. She lost in Wisconsin. But more than that, if you just look at the geography and the bases within each state, right? Obviously, in the state of Minnesota, you have this huge metropolitan area in Minneapolis, St. Paul, that sort of is this base for Democratic votes. You don't really have that in Wisconsin, right? You have Milwaukee, which isn't as big of a metropolitan area as Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Democrats are quite reliant on the big votes coming out of Madison, but you have seen this great degradation of the Democratic base in the more rural areas in Wisconsin. So I still think that Minnesota is the safer bet for Democrats, but obviously the difference between Minnesota and Wisconsin, if you look at the polling data, has shrunk over the last 4 years.
To be clear, you'd rather be Joe Biden than Donald Trump with regard to these numbers. True?
Absolutely true. I mean, you'd much rather be ahead than behind, and Joe Biden's still up by 5-6 points. And if you break it down by the crosstabs, we obviously see that Joe Biden is doing better among white voters without a college degree than Hillary Clinton did 4 years ago. And of course, they make up the plurality, or in fact, the majority of voters in both Minnesota and Wisconsin. So there's no doubt you'd rather be Joe Biden than Donald Trump. But I think you'd rather be Joe Biden 2 months ago than the Joe Biden of today.
Okay. Well said, Harry. When I look at the Minnesota data versus the Wisconsin data or the Pennsylvania data, again, or the Michigan data, recognizing that there are differences of these states, and I'm lumping them into the battleground upper Midwest category. What I do note, and relying, I should say, in some polling that I know you're not comfortable always inciting, but it appears that the Biden margin is smaller in Minnesota than it is in those other states. And the only conclusion that I can draw is that it is attributable to some of the reaction to the post-George Floyd violence and looting. Do you think that's a fair assessment for me to make?
I mean, it's certainly a fair assessment. I don't know if it's a true assessment, right? I mean, there are larger political trends that are at play here, right? Obviously, Minnesota did move significantly to the right in the 2016 election, and I think it's sort of catching up to Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, these other states that have large populations of white voters without a college degree. But I think there's no doubt that the Joe Biden campaign is worried about the events over the last few months, in part because of the poll numbers that we've been citing throughout this segment, but also in part because of common sense and the fact that they're ahead. So I think that's a fair assessment. We'll obviously see if it's a true assessment over the next few months.
Final thought, if I may. So you've got the Trump campaign saying, hey, I'm the thin blue line, holding all of you suburbanites back from what you're seeing on your television screen. The Biden campaign says, I think quite reasonably, wait, this is illogical. We're not in office. Joe's not in office. You are blaming your successor for a situation that's unfolding on your watch. Your response?
I mean, yeah, that's true. Donald Trump is the incumbent. The buck stops there. And the fact is, Donald Trump's approval rating on the protests is not high. It's simply not. His net approval rating is in the -20s. And so, obviously that's what Biden's going to try and do. He's going to try and pin it on Trump. But the one thing I will note is that Donald Trump wants the next few months to be about crime, because that is the issue where he is best on, while Joe Biden wants it to be on the wider question about leadership and also on the protests, because that's where voters trust him most.